Desert Night Twilight. Josephine Josie McAllister had spent her life chasing outlaws, never expecting one from her past to land in her jail. But when Colt Rollins leaned against the bars, his smirk slow and knowing, she felt her resolve slipping. "You gonna keep me locked up forever, darlin'?" he murmured. "Or you finally gonna admit you don't want me to leave?" Chapter 1. The Return of a Ghost. The desert wind whipped through Redemption, Arizona, carrying with it the scent of dust and the faint, haunting melody of a lone coyote's howl. Josephine Josie McAllister, her silver-streaked braid a stark contrast to the deep brown of her leather vest, stood on the porch of the sheriff's office, her gaze fixed on the swirling dust devils dancing across the parched landscape. 58 years she'd lived, and most of them had been spent in this unforgiving land, a land that demanded resilience and offered little in return. She'd seen droughts that cracked the earth and men's spirits, floods that washed away homes and hopes, and outlaws who preyed on the weak. But nothing, not even the harshest winter storm, had ever chilled her as much as the sight that now met her eyes. 3 riders approached, their silhouettes stark against the fiery sunset. Josie's hand instinctively moved to the worn Colt Peacemaker strapped to her hip, the familiar weight of comfort in a world that rarely offered any. As they drew closer, she recognized the lead rider. Tall, lean, with eyes the color of a stormy sky and hair as dark as a raven's wing, even after 20 years, there was no mistaking him. Colt Rollins. The name echoed in her mind, a whisper from a past she'd tried to bury, a past that had just ridden back into her life. The 2 men flanking him were strangers, hard-faced and wary, their hands never straying far from their own weapons. But it was Colt who held her attention, his presence a palpable force that seemed to suck the air from her lungs. He dismounted with an easy grace that belied the years, his movements fluid and dangerous, like a coiled rattlesnake. He hadn't aged the way she expected an outlaw to. Hardened, maybe, by the endless desert and the brutal code they lived, he also held the same drawling confidence. He stopped a few feet from the porch, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in the changes time had wrought. The lines etched around her eyes, the steely glint in her own gaze, the badge that gleamed on her chest, a symbol of the life she'd chosen, a life that stood in stark opposition to his. A slow, knowing smirk curved his lips, the same smirk that had once made her heart flutter and now sent a shiver of unease down her spine. Well, Josie, he drawled, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very ground she stood on. "Sheriff McAllister, I presume?" The sound of his voice, that familiar drawl, sent a wave of memories crashing over her. Memories of stolen kisses under a moonlit sky, of whispered promises that had shattered like glass, of a love that had burned bright and then been extinguished in a storm of betrayal and violence. She forced herself to meet his gaze, her expression carefully neutral, betraying none of the turmoil within. "Colt Rollins," she replied, her voice surprisingly steady. "Last I heard, you were wanted in 3 territories." "A man can't outrun his reputation, darlin'," he said, the endearment a mocking echo of a time-long past. "But I reckon you already know that." "What are you doing here, Colt?" she asked, ignoring the barb. He gestured towards the setting sun. "Just passing through. Needed supplies. Thought I'd pay my respects to an old friend." The word friend hung in the air, laden with unspoken accusations and a history that stretched between them like a taut wire. Josie knew he was lying. Colt Rollins never just passed through anywhere. He was a predator, always hunting, always seeking an advantage. And his presence in Redemption meant trouble. "You're under arrest, Colt," she said, her hand tightening on her Colt. The 2 men beside him shifted, their eyes narrowing, but Colt held up a hand, stopping them. "Now, Josie, is that any way to greet an old acquaintance?" he asked, his voice laced with amusement. "I ain't caused any trouble yet." "You being here is trouble enough," Josie retorted. "Step inside. Slow and easy." He chuckled, a low, throaty sound that sent another shiver down her spine. "Always were a feisty one, Josie. Haven't changed a bit, have you?" He moved towards the steps, his movements deliberate, his eyes never leaving hers. The two men followed, their hands hovering near their guns. Josie's deputy, a young, eager man named Billy, emerged from the office, his rifle raised. "Sheriff?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. "It's all right," Josie said, her gaze still locked on Colt. "Just keep an eye on these two." Colt paused at the threshold, his gaze lingering on her face. He moved closer, and her senses flared. The scent, the leather and gunpowder, were so familiar. "You gonna keep me locked up forever, darlin'?" he murmured, his voice low and intimate, meant only for her ears. "Or you finally gonna admit you don't want me to leave?" His words were a challenge, a dare, a reminder of the tangled web of emotions that still bound them together. Josie felt her resolve waver, the years melting away, leaving her vulnerable and exposed. But she couldn't afford to be vulnerable, not now, not with him. She was the sheriff, and he was an outlaw. That was the reality, the chasm that separated them, a chasm that had been carved by betrayal and loss. She straightened her shoulders, her gaze hardening. "Get inside, Colt," she said, her voice cold and unwavering. "Before I change my mind about taking you in alive." He held her gaze for a moment longer, his eyes searching hers, as if trying to decipher the secrets hidden within. Then, with a final, enigmatic smile, he stepped inside, the shadows of the jailhouse swallowing him whole, leaving Josie standing alone in the gathering darkness, the weight of the past pressing down on her like the endless expanse of the desert sky. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that Colt Rollins' return was not just the end of an old chapter, but the beginning of a new, dangerous game, one where the stakes were higher than ever before, and the prize was not just her survival, but her very soul. The question now, however, was how long they could dance around this old flame without one of them getting burned. Or worse, letting the whole town go up in flames with them. Chapter 2. Bars Between Two Hearts. The cell door clanged shut with a resounding finality, the metallic echo bouncing off the thick stone walls of the Redemption jailhouse. Colt Rollins, however, didn't flinch. He simply leaned against the bars, his arms crossed, that same infuriating smirk playing on his lips. The dim light of the single lantern hanging in the corridor cast long, dancing shadows, making him look even more like a predator caged, a wolf momentarily restrained. Josie stood on the other side of the bars, her arms also crossed, mirroring his stance, a silent battle of wills being waged in the dimly lit space. The air crackled with unspoken tension, a mixture of old memories, lingering resentments, and a spark of something that neither of them was willing to acknowledge. The scent of stale whiskey, sweat, and something indefinably Colt filled the small cell, a stark contrast to the clean, almost sterile scent of the rest of the jailhouse. "Comfortable?" Josie asked, her voice dry, the word laced with sarcasm. Colt chuckled, the sound low and rumbling. "Could use a softer bed, Sheriff. And maybe a bottle of something stronger than that swill you call coffee." "You're in no position to make demands, Rollins," Josie retorted, her gaze unwavering. "You're lucky I didn't leave you for the buzzards." "Now, Josie, that ain't no way to treat an old flame," he drawled, the word deliberately chosen to provoke her. He watched her closely, his eyes like chips of obsidian, searching for any crack in her carefully constructed facade. Josie ignored the bait. "What were you really doing in Redemption, Colt?" she asked, her voice sharp and businesslike. "And don't tell me you were just passing through." He pushed himself off the bars, taking a slow, deliberate step towards her. The movement was fluid, graceful, and undeniably dangerous. Josie didn't flinch, but she felt her heart beat a little faster, her senses on high alert. "Maybe I missed you, Josie," he said, his voice softening, the words a caress that sent a shiver down her spine despite her best efforts to remain unaffected. "Maybe I wanted to see if that fire in your eyes was still burning." Josie scoffed. "Don't flatter yourself, Rollins. The only fire I feel for you is the one that wants to see you hang." He laughed softly, the sound devoid of humor. You always were a terrible liar, darlin'. Even after all these years. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the cold steel bars that separated them. Josie instinctively stepped back, putting a little more distance between them. The proximity, the memories that his presence evoked, were unsettling, a threat to the carefully ordered life she had built for herself. "Tell me why you're here, Colt," she repeated, her voice firmer this time, steeling herself against the pull of the past. "Or you can rot in this cell until the next judge comes through." He sighed, a hint of weariness creeping into his voice. "There's a new gang riding through these parts. The Crimson Hawks. Mean bunch. Led by a man who calls himself Diablo." Josie frowned. She'd heard whispers of the Crimson Hawks, rumors of their brutality and ruthlessness. They were a new threat, a storm brewing on the horizon. "And what does that have to do with you?" she asked, her suspicion growing. Colt shrugged. "They're looking for something. Something valuable. Something that belongs to an old acquaintance of mine. And you're here to protect this acquaintance?" Josie asked, her voice laced with disbelief. "Colt Rollins, the notorious outlaw, playing the hero?" "Let's just say I owe a debt," he said, his gaze shifting away, a flicker of something that looked like regret crossing his features. "A debt I intend to repay." Josie studied him carefully, trying to discern the truth from the lies. Colt was a master of deception, a chameleon who could blend into any situation, play any role. But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of vulnerability, that made her wonder if there might be more to his story than he was letting on. "And what's in it for you?" she asked, her voice softer now, the initial hostility fading slightly. He looked back at her, his gaze intense. "Maybe redemption, Josie," he said, the words sounding strange and unfamiliar on his lips. "Maybe a chance to finally do something right." The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words, with the weight of their shared history. Josie felt a flicker of hope, a dangerous yearning for something she thought she had lost long ago. But she couldn't afford to trust him, not yet. The scars of the past were too deep, the wounds too raw. "I'll look into the Crimson Hawks," she said, her voice betraying none of the turmoil within. "But you stay put. And don't even think about trying anything." He smiled, that slow, knowing smirk returning to his lips. "Wouldn't dream of it, Sheriff," he said. "Not without you, anyway." His words hung in the air, a challenge, a promise, a reminder of the tangled web of desire and danger that still connected them. Josie turned and walked away, the sound of her boots echoing in the silent corridor. She could feel his gaze on her back, burning into her, a constant reminder of the man behind bars, the outlaw who had once held her heart, and who now, once again, threatened to shatter the fragile peace she had found in this unforgiving land. But she couldn't deny the flicker of something else, either. A spark, a hope, a dangerous, undeniable pull that she knew she had to either extinguish or embrace, before it consumed them both. And she didn't know which scared her more. Chapter 3. Echoes of a Shared Past. The aroma of strong coffee and frying bacon filled Josie's small, sparsely furnished office. The morning sun streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air and highlighting the worn wooden desk cluttered with wanted posters, maps, and official documents. Josie sat hunched over a ledger, meticulously reviewing the town's accounts, trying to focus on the mundane details of running a frontier town, but her mind kept drifting back to the man in the cell downstairs. She'd barely slept, tossing and turning in her bed, haunted by images of Colt, by the sound of his voice, by the way he looked at her, as if he could see straight through to her soul. 20 years. 20 years since she'd last seen him, since their lives had been irrevocably torn apart. 20 years of trying to forget, to bury the pain, to build a new life, a life of order and justice, a life where there was no room for outlaws and broken dreams. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Billy, her young deputy, entered, his hat in his hand, his expression a mixture of nervousness and concern. "Morning, Sheriff," he said, his voice hesitant. "Brought you some breakfast. Cooked it myself." Josie managed a small smile. Billy was a good kid, loyal and eager to please, even if he was a bit green around the gills. He'd been with her for 2 years, and she'd come to rely on him, to appreciate his unwavering dedication. "Thank you, Billy," she said, taking the plate he offered. "That's very thoughtful of you." He shuffled his feet, his gaze darting around the room, avoiding her eyes. He hasn't caused any trouble, has he?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Josie knew who he was. "Colt's been quiet," she replied, her voice carefully neutral. "He's still in his cell." Billy nodded, relief flooding his features. "Good. Good," he repeated, as if trying to convince himself. "He's a dangerous man, Sheriff. Everyone knows that." "I know, Billy," Josie said, her voice weary. "I know." He lingered for a moment, as if wanting to say more, then finally blurted out, "You know him, don't you? From before." Josie sighed. The news of Colt's arrival had spread through Redemption like wildfire. And with it, the whispers, the rumors, the speculation about her past, about her connection to the notorious outlaw. "Yes, Billy," she said, her voice resigned. "I knew him. A long time ago." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. They say you were involved." Josie met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "We were young, Billy," she said, her voice soft, tinged with a hint of sadness. "We made mistakes." He nodded slowly, processing her words. "But he's an outlaw, Sheriff. You're the law." "Life isn't always that simple, Billy," Josie said, her gaze drifting towards the window, towards the vast expanse of the desert beyond. "Sometimes, the lines get blurred." He remained silent for a moment, then said, "Just be careful, Sheriff. He's not to be trusted." Josie smiled, a genuine smile this time, touched by his concern. "I appreciate that, Billy," she said. "But I can handle myself. I always have." He nodded again, reassured by her words, and finally left, closing the door behind him. Josie sat alone, the silence of the office pressing down on her. Billy's words echoed in her mind, a stark reminder of the chasm that separated her from Colt, the chasm that had been carved by their choices, by their different paths. She pushed the plate of food away, her appetite gone. She got up and walked to the window, looking out at the town slowly coming to life. The blacksmith's hammer rang out, a rhythmic clang that echoed through the quiet streets. Children's laughter drifted on the breeze. The smell of freshly baked bread wafted from the bakery across the street. It was a scene of normalcy, of everyday life, a life that Colt Rollins had no place in. But as she stood there, gazing out at the familiar landscape, she couldn't help but remember a time when things had been different, when she and Colt had shared dreams, when they had believed in a future together, a future that had been stolen from them. She remembered riding with him across these very plains, the wind in their hair, the sun on their faces, feeling free and alive. She remembered the way he made her laugh, the way he looked at her, as if she were the only woman in the world. She remembered the passion, the fire, the undeniable connection that had bound them together. And she remembered the betrayal. The moment when everything had shattered, when she had discovered the truth about him, about his life, about the darkness that lurked beneath the surface. The memory still had the power to wound her, to make her heart ache with a pain that time had failed to dull. She knew why he had become that man. A story just as tragic as her own. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, trying to push the memories away, to focus on the present, on the task at hand. She had a town to protect, a job to do. She couldn't afford to be distracted by the ghosts of the past, by the reappearance of a man who should have been nothing more than a faded memory. But as she opened her eyes, she saw her reflection in the window, superimposed over the image of the town. And in that reflection, she saw not just the hardened sheriff, the woman who had learned to survive in a harsh and unforgiving world, but also the young girl she had once been, the girl who had loved Colt Rollins with all her heart. And she knew that she couldn't simply lock him away and forget about him. She had to confront him, to confront the past, to finally find out the truth about what had happened, about why he had come back. She had a feeling the why had a lot more to do with her than just some debt to an old acquaintance. She needed answers, not just for herself, but for the sake of the town, for the sake of the fragile peace she had fought so hard to maintain. And she knew that getting those answers would be the most dangerous thing she had ever done. Because some part of her was looking for the same redemption he claimed to seek. Chapter 4. The Price of Loyalty. The midday sun beat down mercilessly on redemption, turning the dusty streets into a shimmering haze. Josie walked towards the small, weathered building that served as the town's only saloon, the Rusty Spur. The swinging doors, etched with bullet holes and faded carvings, creaked open as she entered, revealing a dimly lit interior filled with the usual assortment of roughnecks, miners, and weary travelers. The saloon was owned and operated by Maggie O'Connell, a stout, no-nonsense woman with a fiery red braid and a sharp tongue. Maggie was more than just a saloon owner. She was a confidant, a source of information, and a pillar of the redemption community. She'd also been Josie's closest friend for the past 15 years, one of the few people who knew the truth about her past, about her connection to Colt Rollins. Josie found Maggie behind the bar, polishing glasses with a practiced hand. The saloon was relatively quiet, only a few patrons nursing their drinks in the dim corners. "Maggie," Josie greeted, taking a seat at the bar. Maggie looked up, her eyes, the color of aged whiskey, narrowing slightly. "Josie," she replied, her voice gruff but laced with warmth. "Heard you had a visitor." Josie sighed. "News travels fast in this town. Faster than a prairie fire," Maggie agreed, placing a glass of sarsaparilla in front of Josie. "So, it's true? Colt Rollins is back." "He's in my jail," Josie confirmed, taking a sip of the cool drink. "Claims he's here to repay a debt." Maggie snorted. "Colt Rollins? Repaying a debt? That's a new one." "That's what I thought," Josie said, swirling the liquid in her glass. "He mentioned the Crimson Hawks. Said they were looking for something." Maggie's expression turned serious. "Diablo's crew. They're bad news, Josie. Real bad. Been hearing stories about them raiding ranches, leaving a trail of blood and fire wherever they go." "I know," Josie said, her voice grim. "I need to find out what they're after, and what Colt's connection is to all of this." Maggie leaned closer, her voice lowering. "You think he's telling the truth? About the debt?" Josie hesitated. "I don't know, Maggie. He's always been a good liar. But there's something different about him this time. A weariness, maybe. A hint of regret." Maggie raised an eyebrow. "Regret? Colt Rollins? Don't let your heart cloud your judgment, Josie. You know what he's capable of." Josie nodded, her gaze drifting towards the dusty window, her thoughts swirling. She knew Maggie was right. Colt was dangerous, unpredictable. She couldn't afford to trust him. Not after what had happened between them. But she also couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that there was more to his story, that he was hiding something. "I need to talk to him again," Josie said, her voice firm. "I need to get the truth out of him." "Be careful, Josie," Maggie warned, her eyes filled with concern. "He's got a way of getting under your skin, of making you see what you want to see. Don't let him play you." "I won't," Josie said, her voice resolute. "I'm not that naive girl anymore, Maggie. I'm the sheriff of this town, and I won't let him, or anyone else, threaten it." She finished her drink and stood up, her hand resting on the butt of her Colt. "I'm going back to the jailhouse," she said. "I'll let you know what I find out." Maggie nodded. "Keep your eyes open, Josie. And your gun loaded." Josie smiled, a grim smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Always," she said. As she walked back towards the jailhouse, the heat radiating off the dusty streets, she thought about Maggie's words, about the price of loyalty, about the choices she had made, and the choices she was about to make. She knew that confronting Colt again would be like walking into a minefield, a dangerous dance with a man who had the power to both save her and destroy her. But she had no choice. She had a duty to protect her town, to uncover the truth, even if it meant facing the demons of her past and the man who had once been her greatest love and her greatest betrayer. The weight of the badge on her chest felt heavier than ever, a constant reminder of the responsibility she carried, of the fine line she walked between justice and vengeance, between the law and her own heart. And as she approached the jailhouse, she knew that the choices she made in the next few hours could change not only her life, but the fate of redemption itself. She had to know if Colt was working with the Crimson Hawks, or if somehow this was on the level. Chapter 5. A Town Divided. The news of Colt Rollins' imprisonment had spread through redemption like a contagious disease, infecting the town with a mixture of fear, excitement, and simmering resentment. Josie could feel the tension in the air as she walked through the streets, the whispers following her like shadows, the wary glances of the townspeople weighing heavily on her. Some, like Old Man Hemlock, the town's grizzled blacksmith, spat on the ground as she passed, muttering about outlaws and bringing trouble to decent folk. Others, like Sarah Miller, the young widow who ran the general store, looked at her with a mixture of pity and apprehension, remembering the stories of Josie's past, of her ill-fated romance with the notorious Colt Rollins. The town was divided, split between those who saw Colt as a threat, a reminder of the lawlessness that redemption had fought so hard to overcome, and those who, fueled by rumor and gossip, saw him as a romantic figure, a symbol of rebellion and freedom. And Josie, caught in the middle, was the target of their conflicting emotions, their doubts, and their expectations. She reached the jailhouse, the imposing stone building a stark contrast to the ramshackle wooden structures that surrounded it. Billy was waiting for her outside, his face pale and drawn. "Sheriff," he said, his voice strained. There's a crowd gathering outside. They're there demanding to see Rollins." Josie frowned. She'd expected some reaction, but not this. "Who's leading them?" she asked. Billy hesitated. It's mostly townsfolk, Sheriff. But there are some strangers mixed in. Rough-looking men. I don't recognize them." Josie's suspicion grew. The Crimson Hawks. It was possible they were already here, infiltrating the town, waiting for an opportunity to strike. "Keep them calm, Billy," she said, her voice firm. "Don't let them get out of hand. I'll go talk to Colt." She entered the jailhouse, the cool interior a welcome relief from the scorching heat outside. The familiar scent of stale coffee and gun oil filled the air. She walked towards Colt's cell, her boots echoing on the stone floor. He was standing by the bars, watching her approach, his expression unreadable. The crowd outside had grown louder, their shouts and chants filtering through the thick walls. "Seems like you've made quite an impression on redemption, Rollins," Josie said, her voice dry. Colt shrugged. "A man's got to have his fans," he drawled, but his eyes were serious, devoid of their usual amusement. "They're demanding to see you," Josie said. "Some of them want you hanged. Others, well, let's just say they're curious about the notorious Colt Rollins." "And what does the sheriff want?" he asked, his gaze locking onto hers. "I want the truth, Colt," Josie said, her voice low and intense. "I want to know what the Crimson Hawks are after and what your involvement is. I want to know if you're here to help, or if you're planning to use this town as your personal playground." He leaned closer to the bars, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I told you, Josie. I'm here to repay a debt. An old friend of mine, he's got something Diablo wants. Something valuable." "What is it?" Josie pressed. "And who is this friend?" Colt hesitated. It's complicated, Josie. It's not something I can just explain." "Try me," Josie said, her voice hardening. "Because if you don't start talking, I'm going to let that crowd outside have their way with you. And I don't think you want that." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, as if trying to gauge her sincerity. The shouts from the crowd grew louder, more insistent. "It's a map," he finally said, his voice barely audible above the din. "A map to a lost gold mine. The legendary Widow's Fortune." Josie's eyes widened. The Widow's Fortune. She'd heard the stories, of course. Every frontier town had its legends, its tales of lost treasures and hidden riches. But she'd always dismissed them as nothing more than folklore, campfire stories to entertain weary travelers. "And your friend, who is he?" Josie asked, her voice tight. Colt hesitated again, then said, "His name is Elias Thorne. He was your father's partner." The words hit Josie like a physical blow. Her father. Dead for 20 years, killed in a shootout with a gang of outlaws. The same shootout that had led to Colt's arrest, to his betrayal, to the end of their life together. She stared at him, her mind reeling. Her father's partner. A map to a lost gold mine. The Crimson Hawks. It was all connected, a tangled web of secrets and lies that stretched back to her own past, to the events that had shaped her life. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and confusion. He looked away, his expression pained. I didn't want to involve you, Josie. I didn't want to drag you back into this mess. You should have told me, she said, her voice rising. My father, he was murdered because of this, wasn't he? Because of this map? Colt nodded slowly. Diablo, he wants that gold, Josie. He'll stop at nothing to get it. He'll kill anyone who gets in his way. The shouts from the crowd reached a fever pitch. Josie could hear the sound of splintering wood, the angry roar of the mob. They're coming, Colt, she said, her voice urgent. We need to get out of here. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of desperation and determination. There's a back way, he said. A tunnel. It leads to the old abandoned mine outside of town. Josie knew the mine. It was a dangerous, unstable place, a labyrinth of dark tunnels and crumbling shafts. But it was their only chance. All right, she said, her voice resolute. Let's go. She unlocked the cell door, the metal grating against the stone. Colt stepped out, his eyes meeting hers. For a moment, they stood there, facing each other, the outlaw and the sheriff, bound together by a shared past and a dangerous present. The crowd was breaking through the front. It was now or never. And as they turned and ran towards the back of the jailhouse, towards the hidden tunnel, Josie knew that she was not only running for her life, but for the truth, a truth that had been buried for 20 years, a truth that could finally set her free, or destroy everything she held dear. Chapter 6. Secrets Under the Desert Sun. The tunnel was dark, damp, and claustrophobic. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay, and the only light came from the flickering lantern Josie carried. The rough-hewn walls pressed in on them, and the silence was broken only by the sound of their ragged breathing and the occasional scuttling of unseen creatures. Josie led the way, her Colt drawn, her senses on high alert. Colt followed close behind, his hand resting on the small of her back, a gesture that was both protective and unsettling. The tunnel twisted and turned, a labyrinthine maze that seemed to have no end. How did you know about this tunnel? Josie asked, her voice echoing in the confined space. Elias told me, Colt replied, his voice low. He used to use it to smuggle supplies during the war. Said it was a secret known only to a few. Josie frowned. Another secret. Another layer to the mystery that surrounded her father's death and Colt's involvement. Why didn't you tell me about this before, Colt? She asked, her voice sharper this time. Why keep it a secret? He sighed. I told you, Josie. I didn't want to involve you. I thought I could handle it on my own. Handle it? Josie retorted. You were going to take on Diablo and the Crimson Hawks by yourself? That's suicide, Colt. Maybe, he said, his voice grim. But I owed Elias. He saved my life once. I had to try. Josie stopped, turning to face him. The lantern light flickered across his face, highlighting the lines of strain and fatigue, the shadows of the past that haunted his eyes. And what about me, Colt? She asked, her voice softer now, tinged with a hint of vulnerability. Did you owe me anything? He looked at her, his gaze intense. I owed you everything, Josie, he said, his voice raw with emotion. I owed you my life, my heart, my soul. And I broke it all. I betrayed you. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of unspoken regrets, of lost opportunities, of a love that had been shattered by lies and violence. Josie felt her heart ache, a dull throbbing pain that had never truly gone away. Why, Colt? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Why did you do it? Why did you choose that life? He looked away, his jaw tight. It's a long story, Josie. A story filled with mistakes, with bad choices, with things I can never undo. Tell me, Josie said, her voice firm. I deserve to know. I need to know. He hesitated, then began to speak, his voice low and halting, as if each word were a painful confession. He told her about his childhood, about growing up in poverty, about losing his parents at a young age, about falling in with the wrong crowd, about being drawn into a life of crime, a life that had seemed glamorous and exciting at first, but had quickly turned dark and brutal. He told her about the shootout, about how he'd tried to protect her father, about how he'd been framed, about how he'd been forced to run, to become an outlaw, to live on the fringes of society, always looking over his shoulder, always haunted by the past. As he spoke, Josie listened, her anger slowly giving way to a grudging understanding, a sense of empathy for the man he had been, for the choices he had made, for the pain he had endured. She saw the vulnerability beneath the hardened exterior, the regret that gnawed at his soul. "I never stopped loving you, Josie," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not for a single day. You were the only good thing in my life, the only light in the darkness. And I threw it all away." Josie felt tears welling up in her eyes, tears of grief, of anger, of a love that had never truly died. She reached out, her hand touching his cheek, feeling the roughness of his stubble, the warmth of his skin. I don't know what to say, Colt," she whispered. I need time. Time to process all of this." He nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and despair. "I understand," he said. "I don't expect you to forgive me. But I swear to you, Josie, I'm not the same man I was. I want to make things right. I want to help you stop Diablo. I want to earn your trust back." Josie looked at him, her heart torn. She wanted to believe him, to trust him, to let go of the past and embrace the possibility of a future where they could finally be together. But the doubts lingered, the fears, the memories of betrayal. "We need to focus on getting out of here," she said, her voice regaining its firmness. "We need to find that map, and we need to stop Diablo before he destroys everything." Colt nodded, his gaze resolute. "We'll do it together, Josie," he said. "I promise you." They continued their journey through the dark, winding tunnel, their steps echoing in the silence, their hearts beating in unison, a fragile bond forged in the crucible of the past, a bond that would be tested in the days to come, a bond that could either save them or lead them to their ultimate destruction. The map was everything now. Chapter 7. The Sheriff's Dilemma. They emerged from the tunnel into the blinding sunlight, blinking against the sudden brightness. The air was hot and dry, and the landscape was a desolate expanse of rock and scrub, the abandoned mine a gaping maw in the side of a barren hill. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. Josie surveyed the surroundings, her hand resting on her Colt. The mine entrance was crumbling and unstable, the wooden supports rotting and collapsing. It was a dangerous place, a reminder of the risks and the rewards of the frontier, of the lives that had been lost in the pursuit of riches. "The map should be hidden somewhere inside," Colt said, his voice low. "Elias told me he'd stashed it in a secure location, somewhere only he knew." Josie nodded. "We need to be careful," she said. "This place is a death trap. And we don't know if Diablo's men are already here." They entered the mine cautiously, the darkness swallowing them whole. The air was cooler inside, but thick with the smell of dust and decay. The only light came from Josie's lantern, casting long, dancing shadows that played tricks on their eyes. The mine was a labyrinth of tunnels and shafts, a maze of dead ends and treacherous drops. Josie and Colt moved slowly, their senses on high alert, listening for any sign of danger. They found remnants of the mine's past, rusted tools, broken equipment, and the skeletal remains of a mule, a grim reminder of the harsh realities of frontier life. As they delved deeper into the mine, Josie couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that unseen eyes were following their every move. The silence was oppressive, the darkness suffocating. "Do you remember anything specific about where Elias hid the map?" Josie asked, her voice barely a whisper. Colt frowned. "He mentioned a chamber, a hidden room behind a waterfall. Said it was the only place he felt safe." A waterfall in a mine? It seemed unlikely, but Josie knew that Elias had been a resourceful man, a man of secrets. They continued their search, their hopes dwindling with each passing hour. They found several dead ends, a few collapsed tunnels, and one shaft that dropped so deep they couldn't see the bottom. Just as they were about to give up, they heard it. A faint, rushing sound, like water flowing over rocks. They followed the sound, their hearts pounding with anticipation. They rounded a corner and found themselves in a large chamber, the air surprisingly fresh and cool. And there, at the far end of the chamber, was a waterfall, a thin cascade of water tumbling down a sheer rock face, disappearing into a pool below. "This is it," Colt said, his voice filled with excitement. "This is where Elias hid the map." They approached the waterfall cautiously, their eyes scanning the surrounding walls. The water was clear and cold, and the sound was soothing, a stark contrast to the oppressive silence of the rest of the mine. Colt began to search the area behind the waterfall, his hands feeling along the wet, slippery rocks. Josie kept watch, her Colt drawn, her senses on high alert. Suddenly, Colt let out a cry of triumph. "I found it!" he exclaimed. "I found it!" He held up a small, leather-bound pouch, its surface damp and stained. He opened it carefully, revealing a folded piece of parchment, yellowed with age. It was the map, the widow's fortune. Josie felt a surge of relief, followed by a wave of apprehension. They had found the map, but their journey was far from over. They still had to get out of the mine, evade Diablo and his men, and decide what to do with the treasure. As Colt studied the map, his brow furrowed in concentration, Josie heard a noise behind them. A faint scraping sound, like boots on rock. She whirled around, her Colt raised, her eyes scanning the darkness. A figure emerged from the shadows, a tall, menacing man with a cruel smile and a scar that ran across his left cheek. It was Diablo. Well, Diablo drawled, his voice dripping with malice. "Look what we have here. The sheriff and her outlaw lover. And the map. How convenient." Josie stood her ground, her gaze unwavering. "It's over, Diablo," she said, her voice cold and steady. "You're not getting the map." Diablo laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You think you can stop me, Sheriff? You and your pathetic excuse for a lawman?" He gestured, and several more figures emerged from the shadows, surrounding Josie and Colt. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped in a dark, dangerous mine. Josie felt a surge of despair, a sense of impending doom. But she refused to give up. She had come too far, risked too much, to let Diablo in. She looked at Colt, her eyes meeting his. For a moment, they were not the sheriff and the outlaw, but two people bound together by a shared past, by a love that had endured despite the odds, by a desperate hope for a future that seemed increasingly unlikely. But a future they were, nonetheless, ready to fight for. He held up the map. "Josie," he said firmly, "get out of here. Take this map with you." She shook her head, unable to form the words to express how dangerous that would be. Or how much his offer meant. Diablo interrupted them, his eyes gleaming. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Rollins. It's a long fall down some of these shafts." Josie took a breath, trying to clear her mind. They had a decision to make. They were running out of time. Chapter 8. Whispers of Betrayal. "Don't be a fool, Colt," Josie hissed, her eyes darting between him and Diablo. "We're in this together. We fight together." Diablo chuckled, the sound echoing menacingly in the chamber. "Such touching loyalty," he sneered. "But it won't save you. You're both going to die here, Sheriff. Just like your father did." The mention of her father sent a jolt of anger through Josie. She tightened her grip on her Colt, her finger hovering over the trigger. "You killed him, didn't you?" she said, her voice trembling with rage. "You killed my father." Diablo smiled, a cruel, twisted smile. "He was a stubborn old fool," he said. "He wouldn't give up the map. He paid the price." Josie felt a surge of fury, a desire for vengeance that threatened to consume her. But she knew she had to stay calm, to think strategically. They were outnumbered, trapped, and running out of options. Colt, she said, her voice low and urgent. The waterfall. Can we get through it? Colt nodded. There's a narrow passage behind it, he said. It leads to another tunnel. It's our only chance. Cover me, Josie said, her eyes locking onto Diablo's. She raised her Colt and fired, the shot echoing through the chamber. Diablo ducked, cursing, as his men returned fire. The chamber erupted in a cacophony of gunfire, the air filled with the smell of gunpowder and the screams of wounded men. Josie and Colt scrambled towards the waterfall, the water cascading over them, soaking them to the bone. They found the narrow passage, a crack in the rock face, barely wide enough to squeeze through. Josie went first, her body pressed against the cold, wet stone. Colt followed close behind, shielding her from the gunfire. They emerged into another tunnel, darker and narrower than the last. The sound of the waterfall and the gunfire faded behind them, replaced by an eerie silence. They were safe for now. But they were still trapped in the mine, with Diablo and his men hunting them. We need to find another way out, Josie said, her voice breathless. This tunnel, where does it lead? Colt shook his head. I don't know, he said. Elias never mentioned this passage. It must be another part of the mine. They continued to walk, the darkness pressing in on them. Josie felt a growing sense of unease, a feeling that they were walking into a trap. Suddenly, Colt stopped. Listen, he whispered. Josie strained her ears. She could hear a faint sound, a distant rumble, like the sound of moving earth. What is it? She asked, her voice filled with apprehension. Colt's face paled. I think the mine is collapsing, he said. Diablo, he must have set charges. He's trying to bury us alive. Josie's heart sank. They were trapped, with no way out. The walls of the tunnel began to shake, and small rocks and dust rained down on them. We need to get out of here, Colt. Josie cried, her voice filled with panic. Now. They started to run, their footsteps echoing in the narrow tunnel. The rumbling grew louder, the shaking more violent. The tunnel began to collapse around them, large chunks of rock falling from the ceiling. They stumbled, fell, and scrambled to their feet, their bodies bruised and battered. They were running out of time. Suddenly, they saw a faint light ahead, a glimmer of hope in the darkness. They ran towards the light, their lungs burning, their legs aching. They reached the end of the tunnel and found themselves in a small, open area. But their relief was short-lived. Standing in front of them, blocking their escape, was one of Diablo's men. He was holding a lantern, his face illuminated by the flickering light. And he was pointing a gun at them. Well, he said, his voice smug. Looks like you two lovebirds didn't get very far. Josie and Colt were trapped. Cornered. With no way out. The man raised his gun, his finger tightening on the trigger. Josie closed her eyes, bracing herself for the inevitable. But the shot never came. Instead, she heard a thud, followed by a groan. She opened her eyes and saw the man lying on the ground, unconscious. Standing behind him, holding a rock in his hand, was Billy, Josie's young deputy. Billy! Josie exclaimed, relief flooding through her. How did you find us? Billy grinned, his face covered in dust and grime. I followed the crowd, he said. Heard the commotion. Figured you might need some help. Josie smiled, grateful for his loyalty, for his courage. You saved our lives, Billy, she said. Thank you. But Billy's smile faded. His eyes darted towards Colt, his expression hardening. Sheriff, he said, his voice low and serious. I need to talk to you. Alone. Josie frowned. Something was wrong. She could see it in Billy's eyes, in his body language. A sense of unease crept over her. What is it, Billy? She asked, her voice filled with apprehension. Billy hesitated, then took a deep breath. It's about Colt, Sheriff, he said. I don't think he's who he says he is. I think he's working with Diablo. The words hit Josie like a physical blow. Betrayal. Again. The whispers of doubt that had been lurking in the back of her mind suddenly roared to life, threatening to consume her. She looked at Colt, her eyes searching his, her heart aching with a mixture of anger, confusion, and a desperate hope that Billy was wrong. But deep down, a chilling premonition told her that the young deputy was telling the truth. And the truth was about to shatter everything. Chapter 9. A Desperate Gamble. Josie stared at Billy, her mind reeling. Colt, working with Diablo? It couldn't be true. It shouldn't be true. But the seed of doubt, once planted, began to grow, twisting its tendrils around her heart, choking her with suspicion. "What makes you say that, Billy?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled, betraying none of the turmoil within. She needed to be sure, to have proof, before she condemned the man who, just moments ago, she had been ready to fight alongside, to die with. Billy shifted uneasily, his gaze darting between Josie and Colt. "I saw them, Sheriff," he said, his voice low and hesitant. "Earlier today, before Colt was arrested. I saw him talking to one of Diablo's men, in the alley behind the saloon. They were passing something between them. I couldn't see what it was, but it looked suspicious." Josie felt a cold knot forming in the pit of her stomach. It was circumstantial, but it was also damning. Colt's sudden arrival, his vague explanation about repaying a debt, the map, the Crimson Hawks, it all added up, painting a picture that was far from innocent. She turned to Colt, her eyes narrowed, her expression a mixture of anger and hurt. "Is it true, Colt?" she asked, her voice sharp and accusing. "Were you working with Diablo all along?" Colt met her gaze, his eyes filled with a mixture of defiance and sadness. "Josie, I swear to you," he said, his voice earnest, "I'm not working with Diablo. I would never betray you like that." But Josie couldn't ignore the doubt that gnawed at her. She'd been betrayed by him before, 20 years ago. The scars of that betrayal ran deep, a constant reminder of her vulnerability, of her misplaced trust. "Then explain what Billy saw," she demanded, her voice rising. "Explain why you were meeting with one of Diablo's men." Colt hesitated, his gaze shifting away. It's complicated, Josie," he said. "It's not what you think." "Then tell me what it is," Josie cried, her patience wearing thin. "Tell me the truth, Colt. For once in your life, tell me the truth." He sighed, running a hand through his hair, his expression pained. I was trying to get information, Josie," he said. "I knew Diablo was after the map, and I was trying to find out his plans, to figure out how to stop him. I met with one of his men, yes, but I was trying to play him, to get him to reveal something." It sounded plausible, but Josie couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something, that he was still lying to her. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" she asked, her voice laced with suspicion. "Why keep it a secret?" "I didn't want you to worry," he said. "I didn't want you to get involved." "I thought I could handle it on my own." "You thought you could handle it on your own?" Josie repeated, her voice incredulous. "You were going to take on Diablo and the Crimson Hawks by yourself? That's not brave, Colt. That's reckless. And it's stupid." She turned to Billy, her mind racing. She needed a plan, a way to get out of this mess, a way to stop Diablo and protect her town. "Billy," she said, her voice firm, "I need you to go back to town. Get the townsfolk together, arm them, and prepare for a fight. Diablo and his men are coming, and they're coming for the map." Billy nodded, his eyes filled with determination. "I will, Sheriff," he said. "I won't let you down." "And Billy," Josie added, her voice lowering, "don't tell anyone about what you saw. About Colt. I need to figure this out on my own." Billy hesitated, his gaze flickering towards Colt, then back to Josie. "Are you sure, Sheriff?" he asked. "He's a dangerous man." "I know, Billy," Josie said. "But I need to know the truth. And I need to do it my way." Billy nodded again, reluctantly. "All right, Sheriff," he said. "I'll do as you ask. But be careful." He turned and disappeared back into the tunnel, leaving Josie and Colt alone in the flickering lantern light. Josie turned back to Colt, her expression hardened. "You're coming with me," she said, her voice cold and unwavering. "And you're going to tell me everything. Every single detail. No more lies, Colt. No more secrets." Colt met her gaze, his eyes filled with a mixture of resignation and something else. Something that looked like hope. "All right, Josie," he said. I'll tell you everything. But you need to trust me. Just this once, you need to trust me. Josie hesitated. Trust him? After everything that had happened? It was a gamble, a desperate gamble. But she had no choice. She had to know the truth, even if it broke her heart, even if it meant risking everything. She nodded slowly. Let's go, she said. And pray that we're not too late. They started walking, their steps echoing in the silence, their shadows dancing on the walls. Josie knew that she was walking into a trap of her own making. But she had to do it. She had to confront the past, to confront Colt, to finally uncover the truth, even if it destroyed her. The weight of her badge, the weight of her town's expectations, pressed down on her, a constant reminder of the stakes. And as they walked deeper into the darkness, she knew that the choices she made in the next few hours would determine not only her fate, but the fate of everyone she loved. And she was terrified. Chapter 10. The Unforgiving Land. They walked in silence, the only sound their footsteps echoing in the narrow tunnel. The air was thick with tension, with unspoken accusations and lingering doubts. Josie kept her Colt trained on Colt, her finger hovering over the trigger, ready to act if he made any sudden moves. She didn't trust him. Not yet. Billy's revelation had shaken her to her core, casting a dark shadow over everything Colt had said, everything he had done. She needed proof, concrete evidence, before she could even begin to consider the possibility that he might be telling the truth. Where are we going? She asked, her voice sharp and suspicious. This tunnel, it doesn't seem to be leading anywhere. Colt glanced at her, his expression unreadable. It leads to another exit, he said. A secret way out of the mine. Elias showed it to me years ago. Josie frowned. Another secret. It seemed like Colt's life was a labyrinth of secrets, a tangled web of lies and half-truths. And why should I believe you? She asked, her voice laced with skepticism. For all I know, you're leading me straight to Diablo. He stopped, turning to face her, his eyes filled with a mixture of frustration and hurt. Josie, you have to believe me, he said, his voice pleading. I know I've made mistakes. I know I've betrayed you in the past. But I'm not lying to you now. I swear it. Josie searched his eyes, trying to discern the truth from the lies. She wanted to believe him, to trust him, to recapture the love they had once shared. But the doubt lingered, a cold, nagging voice that whispered in her ear, warning her not to be fooled. Show me, she said, her voice firm. Show me that you're telling the truth. Show me that you're not working with Diablo. Colt nodded. All right, he said. I will. He continued walking, leading her deeper into the tunnel. The air grew colder, and the silence became more oppressive. Josie felt a growing sense of unease, a feeling that they were being watched, that danger lurked around every corner. Suddenly, they heard a noise ahead. A faint scraping sound, like boots on rock. Colt stopped, his body tensing. Someone's coming, he whispered. Josie raised her Colt, her senses on high alert. They waited in silence, their hearts pounding, their eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. A figure emerged from the shadows, a tall, menacing man with a cruel smile and a scar that ran across his left cheek. It was Diablo. Josie felt a surge of fear, but she stood her ground, her finger tightening on the trigger. Well, Diablo drawled, his voice dripping with malice. Looks like the little birds have flown the coop. But they didn't get very far. He gestured, and several more figures emerged from the shadows, surrounding Josie and Colt. They were outnumbered, trapped, and seemingly out of options. It's over, Sheriff, Diablo said, his voice triumphant. Hand over the map, and maybe I'll let you live. Josie looked at Colt, her eyes filled with accusation. This was it. This was the moment of truth. Colt? She said, her voice trembling. What's it going to be? Colt met her gaze, his eyes filled with a mixture of determination and regret. He took a deep breath, and then he did something that Josie never expected. He turned to Diablo, his voice firm and unwavering. You want the map, Diablo? He said. Come and get it. He raised his own gun, not at Josie, but at Diablo. And he fired. The shot echoed through the tunnel, and Diablo staggered backward, clutching his chest. His men opened fire, and the tunnel erupted in a chaos of gunfire and screams. Josie, stunned by Colt's sudden action, didn't hesitate. She joined the fight, firing her Colt at Diablo's men, protecting Colt's back, just as he was protecting hers. They fought side by side, the outlaw and the sheriff, united against a common enemy. The tunnel became a battlefield, a scene of violence and death. Josie saw Colt take a bullet in the arm, but he kept fighting, his face grim, his eyes filled with a fierce determination. She saw Diablo's men fall, one by one, until only Diablo himself was left standing. He was wounded, bleeding, but still defiant. He raised his gun, aiming it at Josie. But before he could fire, Colt shot him again, this time with deadly accuracy. Diablo crumpled to the ground, dead. The silence that followed was deafening. Josie and Colt stood there, breathing heavily, their bodies covered in sweat and blood. They had survived. But at what cost? Josie looked at Colt, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief, gratitude, and something else. Something that felt a lot like hope. Maybe, just maybe, she had been wrong about him. Maybe he had changed. Maybe he was worthy of her trust after all. The unforgiving land had tested them. Now she needed answers. Chapter 11. Shadows of the Past. The echoes of gunfire faded, leaving a heavy silence in their wake, punctuated only by the dripping of water and their ragged breaths. Josie slowly lowered her Colt, her gaze fixed on Colt, who stood leaning against the tunnel wall, his left arm bleeding profusely. The adrenaline that had fueled their desperate fight began to ebb, replaced by a wave of exhaustion and a throbbing pain in her own shoulder, where she'd been grazed by a bullet. You saved me, Josie said, her voice hoarse, still trying to process the sudden turn of events. Colt's actions had been unexpected, a complete reversal of her suspicions. Colt managed a weak smile, his face pale and drawn. Couldn't let him hurt you, darlin', he said, his voice strained. Wouldn't be much of a redemption if I did, would it? Josie felt the knot in her throat, a mixture of relief and guilt. She'd misjudged him, doubted him, and yet he'd risked his life to save hers. Again. We need to get you out of here, she said, her voice urgent. That wound needs tending. She tore a strip of cloth from her shirt and began to bandage his arm, her hands trembling slightly. The closeness, the intimacy of the act, brought back a flood of memories, of a time when they had cared for each other, when they had been everything to each other. Thank you, Josie, Colt said, his eyes meeting hers. For believing in me, even when you had every reason not to. Josie avoided his gaze, focusing on her task. I still don't understand, Colt, she said. Why did you meet with Diablo's man? What were you really doing? He sighed, his expression pained. I told you, Josie. I was trying to get information. I knew Diablo was after the map, and I wanted to know his plans. I made a deal with his man. I promised to give him the map in exchange for information about Diablo's hideout, about his weaknesses. You were going to give him the map? Josie asked, incredulous. After all this? After everything we've been through? It was a fake, Josie, Colt said, his voice weary. I switched the real map with a forgery. I knew they'd be watching me, so I had to make it look convincing. Josie stared at him, her mind racing. It was a risky gamble, a dangerous game of deception. But it explained everything. It explained his secretive behavior, his reluctance to tell her the truth, his apparent betrayal. Why didn't you tell me? She asked, her voice softer now, the anger replaced by a sense of understanding. I couldn't risk it, Josie, he said. I didn't know who I could trust. I didn't know if Diablo had spies in the town, if he had someone watching you. I had to protect you. Josie felt a wave of emotion wash over her, a mixture of guilt, regret, and love. She'd been so quick to judge him, to condemn him, blinded by her past hurts, by her fear of being betrayed again. I am sorry, Colt, she said, her voice trembling. I should have trusted you. I should have known better. He reached out, his good hand gently touching her cheek. "It's all right, Josie," he said. "You had every right to be suspicious. I understand." They stood there for a moment, their eyes locked, the silence filled with unspoken emotions. The shadows of the past seemed to recede, replaced by a glimmer of hope, a possibility of a future that had seemed impossible just hours before. "We need to get out of here," Josie said, breaking the silence. "We need to get back to town. Warn the others." Colt nodded. "There's another tunnel," he said, gesturing with his head. "It leads to the surface, not far from here." They started walking, their steps slow and careful. Colt's wound was slowing him down, and Josie was feeling the effects of her own injuries. But they pressed on, driven by a sense of urgency, by a need to protect their town, to finish what they had started. As they walked, Josie thought about everything that had happened, about the twists and turns, the betrayals and revelations. She thought about her father, about his death, about the map, about the widow's fortune. "Colt," she said, her voice thoughtful. "What are we going to do with the map? With the gold?" He shrugged. "I don't know, Josie," he said. "It's not about the gold, not for me. It's about making things right. About putting an end to this cycle of violence, of greed." Josie nodded. She understood. It wasn't about the treasure, it was about something much more important. It was about redemption, about forgiveness, about finding peace. It was about closing the book on a painful past. They reached the end of the tunnel and emerged into the cool night air. The stars were shining brightly overhead, and the desert stretched out before them, vast and silent. They had made it. They had survived. But their journey was far from over. They still had to face the aftermath, to rebuild their lives, to decide what their future held. And as Josie looked at Colt, her heart filled with a mixture of hope and uncertainty, she knew that whatever happened, they would face it together. The shadows of the past still lingered, but they were no longer as dark, as menacing. They had found their way back to each other, through the darkness, through the danger, through the unforgiving land. And that, she realized, was a treasure more valuable than any gold. Now came the real test. Chapter 12. A Dance with Danger. The air hung heavy with anticipation as Josie and Colt returned to redemption. The town, usually quiet at this hour, was ablaze with activity. Lanterns flickered in windows, casting long, dancing shadows on the dusty streets. The townsfolk, armed with rifles, shotguns, and whatever weapons they could find, had gathered in the town square, their faces grim, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. Billy saw them first, rushing towards them, his face etched with relief. "Sheriff, you're alive. We thought we're all right." "Billy," Josie said, her voice weary but firm. "Diablo's dead. But his men, they might still be out there." Billy nodded, his expression hardening. "We're ready for them, Sheriff," he said. "We'll defend our town." Josie looked around at the assembled townsfolk, her heart swelling with pride and gratitude. These were her people, her friends, her neighbors. They had come together, united against a common enemy, ready to fight for their homes, for their lives. "Maggie's tending to the wounded," Billy added, gesturing towards the saloon. She said Colt needs to get that arm looked at." Josie nodded. "Take him to Maggie, Billy," she said. I'll address the town." Billy hesitated, his gaze flickering towards Colt, then back to Josie. "Are you sure, Sheriff?" he asked. After everything?" Josie met his gaze, her expression unwavering. "I'm sure, Billy," she said. "Colt saved our lives. He's one of us now." Billy nodded slowly, still a bit uncertain, but he obeyed, leading Colt towards the saloon. Josie watched them go, her heart aching for the man she had once loved, the man she was starting to love again. She turned to the assembled townsfolk, her gaze sweeping over their faces. She saw fear, yes, but she also saw courage, resilience, and a fierce determination to protect their community. "People of redemption," she said, her voice strong and clear, ringing out across the town square. "We've faced a great danger tonight. A danger that threatened our homes, our families, our way of life." She told them about Diablo, about the Crimson Hawks, about the map, about Colt's involvement, and about his ultimate act of bravery, of redemption. She told them everything, holding nothing back. Colt Rollins, she said, her voice filled with emotion, is not the man he once was. He's changed. He's risked his life to protect us, to save us. He deserves our gratitude, our respect, and our trust. The townsfolk listened in silence, their faces reflecting a mixture of emotions: surprise, disbelief, relief, and a grudging acceptance. Old Man Hemlock, the blacksmith, who had been one of Colt's most vocal critics, stepped forward, his grizzled face softened with a hint of remorse. "Sheriff," he said, his voice gruff but sincere, "if you say he's all right, then I believe you. We owe him our thanks." Others followed suit, nodding their heads, murmuring their agreement. The tension that had gripped the town began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of unity, of shared purpose. Josie smiled, her heart filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you all. We've been through a lot tonight, but we've come through it together. Stronger. And more united than ever before." The townsfolk cheered, their voices echoing through the night. Josie felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her, but it was a good kind of exhaustion, the kind that came from knowing you had done your best, that you had faced your fears, that you had protected the people you loved. She walked towards the saloon, her steps slow and weary. She needed to see Colt, to make sure he was all right, to talk to him, to finally put the past behind them and embrace the future, whatever it might hold. She entered the saloon, the familiar scent of whiskey and sawdust filling her nostrils. Maggie was behind the bar, tending to Colt's arm, her face etched with concern. Colt saw her and smiled, a weak but genuine smile. "Hey, darlin'," he said, his voice hoarse. "Looks like we made it." Josie smiled back, her heart filled with a mixture of relief and affection. "We did," she said. "We did." Maggie finished bandaging Colt's arm and stepped back, her eyes meeting Josie's. "He'll live," she said, her voice gruff but laced with warmth. "Just needs some rest." "Thank you, Maggie," Josie said, her voice sincere. "For everything." Maggie nodded, her gaze softening. "Go on, you two," she said. "Get some rest. You deserve it." Josie and Colt walked out of the saloon, into the cool night air. The town was quiet now, the excitement over, the danger past. The stars were shining brightly overhead, and a gentle breeze whispered through the streets. They walked in silence, their hands brushing against each other, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had been forged between them, a bond that had been tested by fire and had emerged stronger than ever. They reached Josie's small house at the edge of town, a modest but comfortable dwelling that had been her home for the past 20 years. She unlocked the door and stepped inside, Colt following close behind. The house was dark and quiet, the only light coming from the moon shining through the windows. Josie lit a lantern, casting a warm glow over the familiar surroundings. They stood there for a moment, facing each other, the silence filled with unspoken emotions. The dance was not over, but the music had changed. It was slower now, more intimate, filled with a hesitant hope. The danger had brought them together, but now they had to decide where to go from here. Chapter 13. The Cost of Freedom. Josie turned to Colt, her eyes searching his in the dim light. The events of the night had left them both bruised and battered, physically and emotionally. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken questions, with the weight of their shared past and the uncertainty of their future. "Colt," Josie began, her voice hesitant, "about what happened about the map." He held up a hand, stopping her. "Josie, you don't have to say anything," he said, his voice weary but gentle. "I know I have a lot to answer for. And I will. But not tonight. Tonight, we both need to rest." Josie nodded, understanding. She was exhausted, her body aching, her mind reeling from the night's events. But beneath the exhaustion, there was a flicker of something else, a warmth that had been absent from her life for far too long. "The spare room is just down the hall," she said, gesturing towards a closed door. "There are clean linens in the chest at the foot of the bed." Colt smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Thank you, Josie," he said. "For everything." He turned and walked towards the spare room, his steps slow and deliberate. Josie watched him go, her heart filled with a mixture of emotions, relief, gratitude, uncertainty, and a growing sense of hope. She extinguished the lantern and walked to her own bedroom, the familiar surroundings a comfort in the midst of the turmoil. She undressed slowly, her body aching with every movement. She slipped into her nightgown, the soft cotton a welcome relief against her bruised skin. She lay down in bed, the silence of the house pressing down on her. She closed her eyes, trying to sleep, but her mind was racing, replaying the events of the night, the images of violence, of betrayal, of redemption, flashing before her eyes. She thought about Colt, about his bravery, his sacrifice, his unwavering loyalty. She thought about the map, about the widow's fortune, about the choices they would have to make in the days to come. She thought about her father, about his death, about the secrets that had been buried for 20 years, secrets that had finally come to light. She felt a sense of closure, a sense of peace that had eluded her for so long. But she also felt a sense of fear, of uncertainty. The future was unwritten, a blank page waiting to be filled. She didn't know what it held, what challenges they would face, what choices they would have to make. She tossed and turned, unable to find sleep. The silence of the house was broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards, the whisper of the wind outside. Finally, she got out of bed, unable to bear the solitude any longer. She walked to the window, looking out at the town, bathed in the soft glow of the moonlight. Redemption. It was her home, her sanctuary, the place where she had found peace, where she had built a new life. But it was also a place of danger, of violence, of constant struggle. The frontier was an unforgiving land, a place where life was cheap, where survival was a daily battle. She thought about Colt, about his offer of redemption, about the possibility of a second chance, of a love that had been lost and found again. She wanted to believe him, to trust him, to open her heart to him once more. But the scars of the past ran deep, a constant reminder of her vulnerability, of her misplaced trust. She didn't know if she could ever fully trust him again, if she could ever let go of the fear, of the hurt, of the betrayal. She heard a noise behind her, a soft footstep. She turned and saw Colt standing in the doorway, his silhouette outlined against the dim light from the hallway. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice low and gentle. Josie shook her head.
Too much to think about," she said.
He walked towards her, his steps slow and deliberate. He stopped in front of her, his eyes searching hers. "Josie," he said, his voice hesitant, "I know I've hurt you. I know I've made mistakes. But I swear to you, I'm not the same man I was. I've changed. I want to make things right. I want to be with you." Josie felt her heart ache, a mixture of longing and fear. She wanted to believe him, to surrender to the love that she had tried so hard to suppress, to bury. But the doubts lingered, the whispers of the past echoing in her mind. I don't know, Colt," she said, her voice trembling. "I need time." He nodded, understanding. "I know," he said, "and I'll give you all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere, Josie. I'm here for you. Always." He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek. Josie leaned into his touch, closing her eyes, savoring the warmth of his skin, the tenderness of his gesture. For a moment, they stood there, lost in each other's gaze, the silence filled with unspoken emotions. The cost of freedom, Josie realized, was not just the battles fought, but the choices made afterward, the willingness to trust, to forgive, to embrace the uncertainty of the future. And as she looked at Colt, she knew that she was ready to pay that price, to take that chance, to finally let go of the past and embrace the possibility of a new beginning. But it would be on her terms. Chapter 14. Broken Oaths and New Promises. The morning sun streamed through the window, casting a warm glow over the room. Josie awoke slowly, her body stiff and sore, her mind still heavy with the events of the previous night. She lay in bed for a moment, listening to the sounds of the town coming to life, the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the chatter of voices, the rumble of wagons. She got out of bed, her movements slow and deliberate. She dressed in her usual attire, sturdy trousers, a worn leather vest, and her sheriff's badge, the weight of it a familiar comfort on her chest. She walked to the kitchen, the aroma of coffee filling the air. Colt was already there, sitting at the small wooden table, a cup of coffee in his hand. He looked up as she entered, his eyes meeting hers. "Morning, Josie," he said, his voice soft. "Morning, Colt," she replied, her voice hesitant. The silence stretched between them, awkward and uncomfortable. The events of the night before hung in the air, a reminder of the danger they had faced, of the trust that had been broken and tentatively rebuilt. Josie poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down at the table opposite Colt. She took a sip, the hot liquid warming her from the inside out. "How's your arm?" she asked, her voice concerned. Colt flexed his arm, wincing slightly. "It's sore," he said, "but Maggie did a good job. It'll heal." Josie nodded, her gaze shifting away. She didn't know what to say, how to bridge the gap that still existed between them. "Colt," she began, her voice hesitant, "about last night, about everything." He held up a hand, stopping her. "Josie, I know I have a lot to explain," he said. "And I will. But first, I want to tell you something." He took a deep breath, his eyes locking onto hers. "I love you, Josie," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "I've always loved you. Even when I was running, when I was living a life I'm not proud of, I never stopped loving you. You were the only good thing in my life, the only light in the darkness." Josie felt her heart ache, a mixture of longing and disbelief. She wanted to believe him, to trust him, to surrender to the love that she had tried so hard to suppress. "But the betrayal, Colt," she said, her voice trembling. "How can I ever forget that? How can I ever trust you again?" He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "I know, Josie," he said, "and I don't expect you to forget. But I'm asking you to forgive me. I'm asking you to give me a chance to prove that I've changed, that I'm not the same man I was." He told her everything then. He told her about his past, about his childhood, about the choices he had made, about the mistakes that had led him down a path of violence and crime. He told her about the shootout that had killed her father, about how he'd been framed, about how he'd been forced to run, to become an outlaw. He told her about his years on the run, about the loneliness, the regret, the constant fear. He told her about his encounter with Elias, about the map, about the widow's fortune, about his decision to come back to redemption, to repay his debt, to try to make things right. Josie listened in silence, her heart aching for the man he had been, for the pain he had endured, for the choices he had made. She saw the vulnerability beneath the hardened exterior, the regret that gnawed at his soul. "I know I can never undo the past, Josie," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "But I can try to build a better future. With you. If you'll let me." Josie looked at him, her eyes searching his. She saw the sincerity in his gaze, the honesty in his words. She saw the man she had once loved, the man she had never stopped loving. "I don't know, Colt," she said, her voice hesitant. It's a lot to take in. I need time. Time to process everything, to heal." He nodded, understanding. "I know," he said, "and I'll give you all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere, Josie. I'm here for you, whatever you decide." They sat there for a moment, their hands still clasped together, the silence filled with unspoken emotions. The broken oaths of the past hung between them, but so did the promise of a new beginning, a future built on honesty, on trust, on a love that had endured despite the odds. Josie knew that the road ahead would not be easy. There would be challenges, obstacles, doubts. But she also knew that she was not alone. She had Colt by her side, a man who had faced his demons, who had fought for redemption, who was ready to stand by her, to protect her, to love her. And as she looked at him, her heart filled with a tentative hope, a fragile belief that maybe, just maybe, they could make it work. Maybe they could build a new life together, a life free from the shadows of the past, a life filled with love, with happiness, with peace. It was a risk, a gamble, but it was one she was willing to take. She owed it to herself, and she owed it to him. Chapter 15. The Heart's Reckoning. The days that followed were a period of quiet reflection, of tentative steps towards healing and reconciliation. Josie and Colt spent their time together, talking, sharing their stories, slowly rebuilding the trust that had been shattered so many years ago. They worked side by side, tending to the needs of the town, helping to repair the damage caused by Diablo and his men. They rode together across the vast expanse of the desert, the familiar landscape a silent witness to their shared past and their uncertain future. Josie watched Colt interact with the townsfolk, his actions genuine, his words sincere. He helped Old Man Hemlock repair his forge. He assisted Sarah Miller with her inventory at the general store. He even played with the children in the town square, his laughter echoing through the streets. She saw the respect in their eyes, the acceptance, the gradual easing of the suspicion and fear that had initially greeted his return. She saw the man he had become, the man he was striving to be, honest, compassionate, and deeply remorseful for his past mistakes. But despite the progress they were making, Josie still struggled with her own internal demons. The scars of the past ran deep, and the fear of being betrayed again lingered, a constant shadow that threatened to darken the fragile hope that was blossoming in her heart. One evening, as they sat on the porch of her house, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, Josie finally voiced her doubts. "Colt," she said, her voice hesitant, I want to believe you. I want to trust you. But what if it happens again? What if you leave me again?" Colt turned to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and understanding. "Josie," he said, his voice gentle, "I know I can't undo the past. I can't erase the pain I caused you. But I swear to you, I'm not that man anymore. I've changed. I've learned from my mistakes. And I will never leave you again. Not willingly." He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek. "I love you, Josie," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "I love you more than anything in this world. And I will spend the rest of my life proving that to you, if you'll let me." Josie felt tears welling up in her eyes, tears of grief, of relief, of a love that had never truly died. She leaned into his touch, closing her eyes, savoring the warmth of his skin, the tenderness of his gesture. I love you too, Colt," she whispered, her voice trembling.
I'm just skadet.
He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her, holding her tight. "I know, darling," he said, his voice soothing.
I know.
"But you don't have to be scared anymore. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." They sat there for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, the silence filled with unspoken emotions. The setting sun cast long shadows across the porch, and the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Josie felt a sense of peace wash over her, a calmness that she hadn't experienced in years. She knew that the road ahead would not be easy, that there would be challenges and obstacles to overcome. But she also knew that she was not alone. She had Colt by her side, a man who loved her, who had proven his loyalty, who was willing to fight for their future together. "Colt," she said, her voice soft, "what about the map? What about the widow's fortune?" He smiled, a gentle smile that reached his eyes. "We'll figure it out, Josie," he said. "Together. We'll decide what to do with it, what's best for the town, for our future." Josie nodded, her heart filled with a growing sense of hope. She knew that the gold was not the important thing. What mattered was their love, their trust, their commitment to each other. As they sat there, watching the stars twinkle in the vast expanse of the night sky, Josie finally allowed herself to believe in the possibility of a happy ending. She had faced her demons, she had confronted her past, and she had found her way back to the man she loved. The heart's reckoning had been painful, a journey through darkness and doubt. But it had led her to a place of peace, of forgiveness, of a love that had endured despite the odds. And as she looked at Colt, her heart filled with a quiet joy, a certainty that, together, they could overcome anything. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Josie felt truly free. Free from the shadows of the past, free to love, free to live. Chapter 16. A storm on the horizon. Life in Redemption began to settle into a new rhythm. The wounds, both physical and emotional, inflicted by Diablo's reign of terror slowly began to heal. Colt, now a respected member of the community, worked alongside Josie, helping to maintain law and order, earning the trust of the townsfolk one day at a time. Their relationship, too, continued to blossom, growing stronger with each passing day. They shared quiet evenings on Josie's porch, watching the sunsets, talking about their hopes and dreams, their fears and uncertainties. They rode together across the vast expanse of the desert, the familiar landscape a silent witness to their rekindled love. But the peace they had found was fragile, a delicate balance that could be shattered at any moment. The frontier was an unforgiving land, and danger lurked around every corner. One morning, a rider arrived in Redemption, his horse lathered and exhausted, his face etched with worry. He was a rancher from the outskirts of town, a man named Jedediah, known for his honesty and his hard work. "Sheriff," he exclaimed, his voice breathless. "We've been raided. Cattle rustled, horses stolen, they left a message." Josie's heart sank. She knew, even before Jedediah spoke the words, who was responsible. "The Crimson Hawks?" she asked, her voice grim. Jedediah nodded, his eyes filled with fear. They said they weren't finished with Redemption," he said. They said they'd be back." Josie felt a chill run down her spine. Diablo was dead, but his gang was still out there, a threat that hung over the town like a dark cloud. "Did they say anything else?" she asked, her voice urgent. "Anything about what they want?" Jedediah hesitated. They mentioned a name," he said. They said they were looking for Rollins." Josie's gaze shifted to Colt, who had been standing nearby, listening intently. His face was pale, his eyes filled with a mixture of apprehension and determination. "They know I'm here," he said, his voice low. "They know I killed Diablo. They're coming for revenge." Josie felt a surge of anger, a fierce protectiveness towards the man she loved. She wouldn't let them hurt him. She wouldn't let them destroy the fragile peace they had found. "We'll be ready for them, Colt," she said, her voice firm. "We'll fight them. We'll protect our town." She turned to Billy, who had arrived on the scene, his face etched with concern. "Billy," she said, "gather the townsfolk. Arm them. Prepare for a fight. We need to be ready for anything." Billy nodded, his eyes filled with determination. "I will, Sheriff," he said. "We won't let them take our town." The news of the raid spread through Redemption like wildfire, casting a pall of fear and uncertainty over the community. But the townsfolk, united by their shared experience, by their love for their home, stood firm. They prepared for battle, their faces grim, their eyes filled with a fierce resolve. Josie and Colt worked tirelessly, organizing the defenses, training the townsfolk, preparing for the inevitable confrontation. They knew that the Crimson Hawks were a formidable enemy, ruthless and well-armed. But they were determined to fight, to protect their town, to defend their love. As the days passed, the tension in Redemption grew thicker, the anticipation building like a storm on the horizon. The townsfolk kept watch, their eyes scanning the horizon, waiting for the first sign of the approaching enemy. One evening, as Josie and Colt stood on the porch of her house, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of red and orange, they saw it. A cloud of dust on the horizon, growing larger with each passing moment. "They're here," Colt said, his voice low. Josie nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. The storm had arrived. The battle was about to begin. She looked at Colt, her eyes meeting his. She saw the fear in his eyes, but she also saw the courage, the determination, the unwavering love. "We'll face them together, Colt," she said, her voice firm. "We'll fight for our town, for our future, for our love." He smiled, a grim smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Together, Josie," he said. "Always." They turned and walked towards the town square, where the townsfolk were gathered, armed and ready. The storm had arrived, and Redemption was about to face its greatest test. But they were not afraid. They were united, they were strong, and they were ready to fight for their freedom, for their lives, for their love. The cost of freedom was high, but they were willing to pay it. Together. Chapter 17. Crossroads of Fate. The Crimson Hawks rode into redemption like a vengeful storm, their horses' hooves pounding the dusty streets, their war cries echoing through the town. They were a motley crew of outlaws, their faces hardened by years of violence and crime, their eyes gleaming with malice and greed. Josie and Colt stood at the head of the townsfolk, their weapons drawn, their faces grim, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. They were outnumbered, but they were not outmatched. They had the advantage of knowing the terrain, of fighting for their homes, for their loved ones. "Hold your fire," Josie shouted, her voice ringing out across the town square. "Wait for my signal." The townsfolk, their faces tense, their fingers hovering over their triggers, obeyed her command. They stood their ground, a wall of defiance against the approaching onslaught. The leader of the Crimson Hawks, a hulking brute with a scarred face and cold, cruel eyes, rode forward, his horse prancing nervously. He was known as Scarface, Diablo's second-in-command, a man even more ruthless and bloodthirsty than his predecessor. Well, Scarface drawled, his voice dripping with menace. "Look what we have here. The sheriff and her outlaw lover. Come to surrender, have you?" Josie met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. "We're not surrendering, Scarface," she said, her voice cold and steady. "We're here to fight, to defend our town." Scarface laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You think you can stop us, Sheriff?" He sneered. "You're outnumbered, outgunned, and outmatched. You're going to die here, just like your precious Diablo." "We'll see about that," Colt said, his voice low and dangerous. He stepped forward, his Colt raised, his eyes locked onto Scarface's. The tension in the air was palpable, a thick, suffocating blanket that threatened to smother them all. The townsfolk waited, their breaths held, their eyes fixed on the two figures facing each other, the outlaw and the lawman, their fates intertwined. "This is between you and me, Scarface," Colt said, his voice calm but firm. "Let the town be. This is about revenge, isn't it? About Diablo?" Scarface's eyes narrowed, his gaze flickering between Colt and Josie. He saw the determination in their eyes, the unwavering resolve. He knew that they wouldn't back down, that they would fight to the death. "You killed him," Scarface said, his voice filled with hatred. "You killed my brother, and for that you're going to pay." "He was going to kill Josie," Colt said, his voice unwavering. "I did what I had to do." "Enough talk," Scarface said, his voice rising. "Let's get this over with." He raised his own gun, aiming it at Colt. Josie saw the movement, and without hesitation, she raised her own Colt and fired. The shot echoed through the town square, and Scarface staggered backward, clutching his chest. He looked at Josie, his eyes filled with surprise and disbelief. Then he crumpled to the ground, dead. The Crimson Hawks, stunned by the sudden death of their leader, hesitated for a moment, their attack faltering. Josie seized the opportunity.
"Now,"
she shouted, her voice ringing out across the town square.
"Fire."
The townsfolk opened fire, a volley of shots that ripped through the ranks of the Crimson Hawks. The outlaws, caught off guard, returned fire, and the town square erupted in a chaos of gunfire, screams, and the thunder of hooves. Josie and Colt fought side by side, their movements synchronized, their trust in each other absolute. They were a force to be reckoned with, the outlaw and the sheriff, united against a common enemy. The battle raged, fierce and brutal. The townsfolk, fighting for their homes, for their lives, fought with a courage and determination that surprised even themselves. They were farmers, shopkeepers, blacksmiths, ordinary people who had been pushed to the brink, forced to defend their way of life. Josie saw Billy, his face covered in grime and sweat, fighting bravely alongside Old Man Hemlock, the two of them working together, protecting each other's backs. She saw Maggie, armed with a shotgun, defending the saloon, her eyes blazing with defiance. The Crimson Hawks, despite their initial advantage, began to falter. They were disorganized, their leadership gone, their morale shattered. They were no match for the united force of redemption. One by one, the outlaws fell, until finally, Only a handful remained. They turned and fled, their horses galloping out of town, leaving behind a trail of dust and death. The silence that followed was deafening. Josie and Colt stood there, breathing heavily, their bodies covered in sweat and blood. They had won. They had defended their town. The townsfolk cheered, their voices echoing through the streets. They had faced their greatest test, and they had emerged victorious. Josie looked at Colt, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief, gratitude, and love. They had done it. They had faced the storm, and they had survived. Together, they had reached a crossroads and chosen the path of courage, of unity, of love. And that path had led them to victory. Chapter 18. The Weight of the Badge. The aftermath of the battle was a scene of both devastation and resilience. Buildings were damaged, some beyond repair, and the streets were littered with the debris of the fight. But amidst the chaos, there was a sense of unity, a shared pride in their victory, a quiet determination to rebuild, to heal, to move forward. Josie, despite her exhaustion, moved through the town, checking on the wounded, offering comfort and support, coordinating the cleanup efforts. She was the sheriff, the leader, the symbol of hope and resilience for the people of Redemption. Colt, his arm bandaged and his body aching, worked alongside her, his presence a source of strength and reassurance. He had proven himself, not just as a fighter, but as a man of honor, a man worthy of trust and respect. As they worked, Josie couldn't help but reflect on the weight of the badge she wore, the responsibility it represented. It was more than just a symbol of authority, it was a symbol of hope, of justice, of protection. It was a commitment to the people of Redemption, to their safety, to their well-being. She had always taken that responsibility seriously, but the events of the past few weeks had deepened her understanding of its significance. She had faced betrayal, violence, and loss, but she had also witnessed courage, resilience, and unwavering love. She had seen the best and the worst of humanity, and she had learned that even in the darkest of times, there was always hope, always the possibility of redemption. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the town, Josie and Colt found themselves standing in the middle of the town square, surveying the damage, their shoulders brushing against each other. "We did it, Josie," Colt said, his voice weary but filled with a quiet pride. "We saved Redemption." Josie nodded, her heart filled with a mixture of emotions, relief, gratitude, exhaustion, and a profound sadness for the lives lost, for the damage done. "We did," she said, her voice soft. "But at what cost?" Colt looked at her, his eyes filled with understanding. "Freedom always has a cost, Josie," he said. "But it's a price worth paying."
Josie knew he was right.
The fight for freedom, for justice, for peace, was never easy. It required sacrifice, courage, and unwavering determination. "What now, Colt?" she asked, her voice hesitant.
"What happens now?"
He smiled, a gentle smile that reached his eyes. "Now we rebuild," he said. "We heal. We move forward.
Together."
Josie nodded, her heart filled with a tentative hope. The future was uncertain, but she was not afraid. She had Colt by her side, and she had the unwavering support of the people of Redemption. "And the map, Colt?" she asked, her voice thoughtful. "The widow's fortune, what do we do with it?" Colt shrugged.
"I don't know, Josie," he said.
"It's not about the gold. Not for me. It never was." Josie understood. The gold was just a symbol, a representation of the greed and violence that had plagued the frontier for so long. It was the cause of so much pain, so much loss. Maybe we should destroy it," she said, her voice hesitant. "Maybe we should get rid of it, once and for all." Colt looked at her, his eyes filled with surprise. "Are you sure, Josie?" he asked. "That gold, it could help rebuild the town. It could help a lot of people." Josie nodded. "I know," she said. "But it's tainted, Colt. It's stained with blood. I don't want it. I don't want anything to do with it." Colt considered her words, his gaze thoughtful.
He knew she was right.
The gold was a symbol of the past, of the darkness they had fought so hard to overcome. "All right, Josie," he said. "We'll destroy it. We'll get rid of it, together. They walked towards the abandoned mine, the place where it had all begun, the place where they had found the map, where they had faced Diablo, where Colt had proven his loyalty. They entered the mine, the darkness swallowing them whole. The air was cool and damp, and the silence was broken only by the sound of their footsteps and the occasional drip of water. They reached the chamber where they had found the map, the waterfall still cascading down the rock face, disappearing into the pool below. Colt took the map from his pocket, the leather-bound pouch worn and stained. He looked at it for a moment, his face etched with a mixture of regret and determination. Then, without a word, he tossed it into the waterfall, the map disappearing into the swirling water, lost forever. Josie watched it go, her heart filled with a sense of closure, of peace. It was over. The past was finally buried. The widow's fortune was no more. They turned and walked out of the mine, leaving the darkness behind, stepping into the warm glow of the setting sun. They had made their decision. They had chosen their path. They had chosen love, hope, and a future free from the shadows of the past. The weight of the badge still rested on Josie's chest, but it felt lighter now, less burdensome. She had done her duty, she had protected her town, and she had found her own redemption, her own peace. And as she walked alongside Colt, her hand in his, she knew that, together, they could face anything. The future, although still a mystery, no longer frightened. Chapter 19. A showdown of wills. The destruction of the map, while symbolic, did not magically erase all the problems facing redemption. The town still needed to be rebuilt, the wounded needed tending, and the lingering threat of the remaining Crimson Hawks, though scattered, still loomed. Josie, ever the pragmatic sheriff, knew that a symbolic gesture wouldn't be enough. "We need to send a message," Josie said to Colt and Billy, gathered in her office the morning after the battle. "We need to show them, and any other outlaws thinking of targeting redemption, that we won't be intimidated." Billy nodded, his young face set with determination. "We can form a posse, Sheriff," he said. "Track down the remaining Hawks, bring them to justice." Colt, however, was hesitant. "That could be dangerous, Billy," he said. "We don't know how many of them are left, or where they're hiding. We could be walking into an ambush." Josie understood Colt's concerns. She didn't want to risk any more lives unnecessarily. But she also knew that they couldn't afford to appear weak, to allow the Crimson Hawks to regroup and strike again.
"We need to be smart about it," she said.
"We need information. We need to know where they're hiding, what their plans are." She looked at Colt, her eyes questioning.
"Colt, you know these men," she said. "You know how they think."
"Do you have any idea where they might have gone?" Colt frowned, his brow furrowed in thought. "There are a few possibilities," he said. "Old hideouts they used to use. But there's one place that's most likely. A canyon, about a day's ride north of here. It's well hidden, easily defensible. It's where Diablo used to plan his raids." Josie nodded. "All right," she said. "We'll go there. But we'll go quietly. Just the three of us. We'll scout it out, assess the situation, and then decide how to proceed." Billy looked disappointed, but he didn't argue. He knew that Josie was right. A large posse would be too obvious, too easy to spot. They needed to be stealthy, to take the Crimson Hawks by surprise. They set out at dawn, riding north across the vast expanse of the desert. The landscape was harsh and unforgiving, a reminder of the challenges they faced, of the constant struggle for survival. As they rode, Josie couldn't help but think about the showdown that was looming, the inevitable confrontation with the remaining Crimson Hawks. It was a battle of wills, a test of their courage, their determination, their commitment to justice. She knew that Colt was struggling with his own internal demons. He had chosen to side with redemption, to fight against his former comrades, but she knew that it wasn't easy for him. He had a history with these men, a bond that, however twisted, still existed. "Colt," she said, her voice soft, "are you all right? You seem distant." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and regret. "I'm just thinking," he said, "about these men, about the choices they've made, the lives they've led. It could have been me, Josie. If I hadn't met you, if I hadn't found a reason to change, I could have been one of them. Josie reached out, her hand touching his arm.
But you're not, Colt, she said.
You're not one of them. You're a good man. You've proven that. He smiled, a weak smile that didn't quite reach his eyes.
Thank you, Josie, he said, for believing in me.
Even when I didn't believe in myself. They rode in silence for a while, the only sound the rhythmic beat of their horses' hooves and the whisper of the wind. As they approached the canyon, Josie felt a growing sense of unease, a premonition of danger. They dismounted, leaving their horses hidden in a cluster of rocks. They proceeded on foot, cautiously, their weapons drawn, their senses on high alert. The canyon was narrow and winding, with steep, rocky walls that rose high above them. It was a perfect place for an ambush, a natural fortress that offered protection and concealment. As they rounded a bend, they saw it, a camp, nestled in a small clearing, smoke rising from a campfire, several men milling about, their weapons visible. The Crimson Hawks. Josie, Colt, and Billy crouched behind a large boulder, observing the scene. There were about a dozen of them, heavily armed and clearly on edge. What do we do, Sheriff? Billy whispered, his voice tense. Josie hesitated. They were outnumbered, and the terrain favored the outlaws. A direct assault would be suicidal. We need to find a way to even the odds, she said. We need to create a diversion. Draw some of them away from the camp. She looked at Colt, her eyes questioning.
Colt, you know this canyon, she said.
Is there another way in? A back entrance?
Colt nodded.
There's a narrow trail, he said. It leads to the top of the canyon, overlooking the camp. It's steep and treacherous, but it's possible to climb it. Josie made a decision. All right, she said. Colt, you and Billy take the trail. Get to the top of the canyon. I'll create a diversion. Draw their attention to the entrance. When you're in position, give me a signal. Then we'll attack. It was a risky plan, a desperate gamble. But it was their only chance. They were in a showdown of wills, and Josie was determined to win. Not just for redemption, but for Colt, for Billy, for the future they were fighting for. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. Josie's plan was daring, a high-stakes gamble that relied on perfect timing and unwavering courage. She watched as Colt and Billy disappeared into the shadows, making their way towards the treacherous trail that led to the top of the canyon. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the confrontation to come. She stepped out from behind the boulder, her Colt drawn, her silhouette stark against the backdrop of the canyon walls. She walked slowly, deliberately, towards the Crimson Hawks camp, her boots crunching on the rocky ground. The outlaws saw her immediately, their heads snapping up, their eyes widening in surprise and disbelief. They scrambled for their weapons, their shouts echoing through the canyon. It's the sheriff. One of them yelled. She's alone. Josie kept walking, her gaze fixed on the camp, her finger hovering over the trigger. She knew that she was walking into a trap, that she was outnumbered and outgunned. But she had to buy Colt and Billy time, to give them a chance to get into position. Hold your fire, she shouted, her voice ringing out across the canyon. I want to talk. The outlaws hesitated, their weapons trained on her, their faces filled with suspicion and hostility. A man emerged from the group, his face scarred and weathered, his eyes cold and cruel. He was one of the remaining lieutenants of the Crimson Hawks, a man known for his ruthlessness. What do you want, Sheriff? He sneered. Come to beg for your life. I'm here to offer you a chance to surrender, Josie said, her voice firm and unwavering. Lay down your weapons, and you'll be treated fairly. Resist, and you'll be killed. The outlaw laughed, a harsh, grating sound. You think we're afraid of you, Sheriff? He said. You're one woman, against a dozen of us. You don't stand a chance. I'm not alone, Josie said, her voice calm but firm. She gestured towards the top of the canyon, where Colt and Billy were, hopefully, getting into position. I have men up there, waiting for my signal. You're surrounded. It was a bluff, a desperate attempt to intimidate the outlaws, to buy more time. She didn't know if Colt and Billy were in position yet, or if they could even be seen from the camp. The outlaw hesitated, his eyes scanning the top of the canyon, his face etched with uncertainty. He didn't know if Josie was telling the truth, if she was bluffing, or if she was truly surrounded. Suddenly, a rock came tumbling down from the top of the canyon, landing with a thud near the campfire. It was Colt's signal. They were in position. Josie seized the opportunity.
Now,
she shouted, her voice ringing out across the canyon. She raised her Colt and fired, the shot echoing through the narrow space. At the same moment, Colt and Billy opened fire from above, their bullets raining down on the unsuspecting outlaws. The Crimson Hawks, caught completely by surprise, scrambled for cover, their shouts and screams mixing with the thunder of gunfire. The canyon erupted in chaos, a maelstrom of violence and death. Josie, fighting with a fierce determination, moved from cover to cover, her Colt blazing, her aim true. She saw Colt and Billy, their figures silhouetted against the sky, firing down on the outlaws, their shots finding their marks. The Crimson Hawks, trapped between Josie's fire from below and Colt and Billy's fire from above, were being decimated. One by one, the outlaws fell, until finally, only the lieutenant remained. He was wounded, bleeding, but still defiant. He raised his gun, aiming it at Josie. But before he could fire, Colt shot him from above, the bullet striking him squarely in the chest. The lieutenant crumpled to the ground, dead. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of Josie's ragged breathing and the distant cries of birds. The battle was over. They had won. Josie slowly lowered her Colt, her body trembling with exhaustion and relief. She looked up at the top of the canyon, where Colt and Billy were standing, their figures silhouetted against the bright sky. They made their way down the treacherous trail, their faces etched with a mixture of exhaustion and triumph. They reached the bottom of the canyon, and Josie and Colt rushed towards each other, embracing in a fierce hug. "We did it, Josie," Colt said, his voice filled with emotion. "We did it." Josie nodded, tears streaming down her face. "We did," she said. "It's over. It's finally over." They stood there for a moment, holding each other, savoring the victory, the relief, the love that had bound them together through it all. The final confrontation had been a test of their courage, their determination, their love. And they had passed. They had faced their demons, they had fought for their future, and they had emerged victorious. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the canyon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. It was a scene of peace, of tranquility, a stark contrast to the violence that had just taken place. Josie, Colt, and Billy stood together, looking out at the vast expanse of the desert. They had a long journey ahead of them, a journey of healing, of rebuilding, of creating a new future together. But they were not afraid. They were strong, they were united, and they were ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The horizons were clear now, and their hearts were finally free. Epilogue. The years that followed were a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the enduring power of love, and the unwavering commitment to building a better future. Redemption, once a town teetering on the brink of destruction, blossomed into a thriving community, a beacon of hope in the unforgiving landscape of the frontier. Josie remained the sheriff, her badge a symbol of justice, of protection, of unwavering dedication to the people she served. She was respected, admired, and loved by the townsfolk, her name whispered with reverence and gratitude. Colt, no longer an outlaw, but a respected member of the community, worked alongside Josie, his past mistakes forgiven but not forgotten. He became her deputy, his skills and experience invaluable in maintaining law and order. He was a constant presence in her life, a source of strength, of support, of unwavering love. Billy, no longer the greenhorn deputy, matured into a capable and courageous lawman, learning from Josie and Colt, embodying the values of integrity and justice that defined redemption. The widow's fortune, a legend that had fueled greed and violence, remained a forgotten memory, buried beneath the sands of time. The map was gone, its secrets lost forever, a symbol of the past they had chosen to leave behind. Josie and Colt, their love tested by fire, emerged stronger, their bond unbreakable. They married in a simple ceremony in the town square, surrounded by the people they loved, the people they had fought to protect. They built a life together, a life filled with love, with laughter, with the quiet joys of everyday existence. They shared their home with stray animals, with orphan children, with anyone who needed a helping hand, their hearts overflowing with compassion and generosity. They often rode together across the vast expanse of the desert, the familiar landscape a silent witness to their enduring love, their shared history, their hopeful future. They would pause on a rise, overlooking the town, the setting sun casting long shadows across the land, and they would remember. They would remember the battles fought, the lives lost, the sacrifices made. They would remember the darkness they had overcome, the challenges they had faced, the love that had sustained them through it all. And they would look to the future, a future filled with promise, with hope, with the unwavering belief that together they could overcome anything. They had built a life, a home, a community on the foundations of love, trust, and forgiveness. As the years passed, Josie's hair turned silver and Colt's face became lined with the marks of time and experience. But their love remained as strong as ever, a beacon of hope in a world that often seemed dark and unforgiving. One evening, as they sat on the porch of their house, watching the stars twinkle in the vast expanse of the night sky, Josie leaned her head on Colt's shoulder, her hand in his. "We did it, Colt," she said, her voice soft, filled with a quiet contentment. "We built a good life." Colt smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "We did, darlin'," he said. "We sure did." They sat there in silence, their hearts filled with gratitude, with peace, with a love that had endured the test of time, a love that had conquered all. The frontier had shaped them, tested them, and ultimately brought them together. And as they looked out at the endless horizon, they knew that their journey, though filled with challenges, had been worth it. They had found their redemption, their peace, their forever, in each other's arms. And that, they knew, was all that truly mattered. The end.